My childhood and what I remember about it. For as long as I can remember, my dad he hasn't been with my mom. They split when I was too young to remember. He went back to his first wife. And so it was a lot of back and forth. My mom eventually got out of the military. They were both in the military. She got out, and I'd go back and forth between mom and dad. My dad moved back to the East Coast. My mom stayed out in the West. So for as long as I can remember, it's been back and forth. Now my dad, because he was still employed, he was still under contract in the military. There were still tours that he had to do. So he was gone for most of my childhood. Thinking back, all of my achievements, my first sports games, he wasn't there. He wasn't there. And but I never held it against him. I didn't look at it like, oh, he's just not here. He's a horrible dad. He was serving. He was out at war, you know. I didn't know the severity of it. You know, I've heard about people dying in war, the casualties. But as a child, my dad was invincible, at least to me. And so in my mind, he was doing what he needed to do. Looking back, absolutely, my dad wasn't there, so my character was underdeveloped. I did not have an identity. I would search for it wherever I was accepted. You know, I would try to get in where I fit in. So early on, I was the class clown. You know, everyone loves the class clown. And because I was so accepted and admired as being somebody who was funny and who got in trouble and who acted like he didn't care, my peers accepted it, and so I found acceptance in that. And I think for me, that's where trouble started. And so it got to the point where I would get in so much trouble when my dad was deployed that my stepmom would have no other choice but to send me back to my mom in California. But the thing is, when you have a kid who is going back and forth between middle class and low class, my mom was not always financially stable. And so I'm leaving middle class and I'm going to essentially the lower class of Northeast LA. And I was just more influenced by the streets at that time and by the culture of what LA is. And it's completely different from Maryland. It's utterly distasteful. It feels like there's no hope. Your only life is growing up and having a future in the streets, being a gang member or being an affiliate. You know, it's not what you know, it's who you know, at least out there. Out here in Maryland, I felt like it was more like what you know, not necessarily who you know, just what you know, how to survive, how to maintain, and just maneuver yourself. You know, and I was a kid, I was growing up, so. But LA really molded and shaped my outlook on life at that time. You know, without a dad, I knew big homies. That's what we called them. They were friends that were much older. They were what we now know as low lives. You know, 30-year-old bums who were still living at mom and dad's house. 40-year-old parolees. You know, who we called OGs, who have all this wisdom and insight on wickedness. They can train you in the things that are wicked. You know. And they delighted in that. And so that's where my identity had really surfaced. I wanted to be like them. They were the cool ones. Nobody messed with them. Everybody respected them. I wanted to be just like that. And that mentality really, it broke me in half. It shaped me from there on. Because at that age, I was 13. I knew my identity was street. My mentality was street. My mom was pregnant with my youngest brother at that time, and her current husband was just sick of my disobedience. They couldn't control me. My dad was still overseas, so there was really no authority in my life except whatever the streets brought, you know.
So how did that make you feel when you know that identity and searching for that identity and knowing that, you know, there's only one man, which was your dad? Like, tell us a little bit of why was it so important for you to have your dad around?
The father instills identity. It's naturally, it's nature's way of progressing. It's how God made it. The dad instills identity in all the kids. Looking back, what I felt then, it wasn't really a big issue. I thought my dad was doing exactly what he needed to, and because he wasn't there, because there was no governance over my life, because there was no one I answered to at home, I felt like I had to create my own path. And whatever path that I made, it had to be something of relevance, at least with what I was going through and what I was faced with. So it really wasn't much emotion and much thought. It was just more instinct. What do I need to do today to survive, right? Am I gonna have fun today? What kind of fun am I gonna get in? Am I gonna avoid the law? Am I gonna meet X amount of girls? Am I gonna put my hands on another person? What am I doing today? What do I need today? Do I need money? Right? Do I need to get drunk? What do I feel today? It was just more instinct. It was more animalistic, because I had no goal. California is 100 times different than Maryland. In California, it's about cliques, and so that's what I was first introduced to. And that's, if you can imagine, there's steps. You start out with the clique, and then you're future something. You are a future gang member. You're a future this. You're a future Blood, Crip, Avenue, Highland Park gang. You're a future something. But it all starts with the clique. And so I took that mentality back to Maryland, right? Maryland, at least in the neighborhood that I was in, it wasn't known for gangs, right? There weren't serious gangs. I mean, you hear about things, but it wasn't like California. And so we began our own little clique, me and one of my best friends at that time. And we inherited beef with different neighborhoods. Everyone started clicking up, and these are people that we went to school with. We all started clicking up, and in one terrible day, we ran into people. I put my hands on somebody, and they lost their life. I was 14 years old with the mentality of wanting to be a future gang member. And something so silly and stupid, I can't call it beef because it wasn't beef. It wasn't that. It was more of me wanting to impress people. Me wanting to be somebody that I was not called to be. But I made a choice. I put my hands on somebody, and it cost them their life at the age of 14. How
did that change your life?
I was charged with manslaughter. And if you can imagine, just for a kid, I mean, I was a kid. I was a kid trying to be a grown man. And as a kid, I was charged with manslaughter. It sounds exactly how scary it was. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what the outcome was. I only knew by TV shows, by news, that manslaughter is 10 to 15. So 14 years old, I'm thinking I'm getting locked up for 10 to 15 years, if not the rest of my known life. I won't get out until I'm old and gray.
At this time, did you have a relationship with God yet? And how did your parents feel about this?
I knew of God, but he didn't factor into anything. My instinct was so animalistic, it wasn't about God. It was just about me and my instinct to live. My dad was disappointed, he wasn't there. He wasn't there a lot, and how he was raised, I don't really know too much, but I can imagine that it was the same. His dad wasn't there, but my dad is successful, and so my dad chose a successful route, and my dad has other kids, and they're fairly successful, and so I think when the news hit him, there was disappointment. I was the black sheep. I was the one who messed up, who made the wrong decision, and so I think there was disappointment because he expected more. I couldn't give that to him. My mom was heartbroken and heart shattered. Now along the way, she was saved. She had her own encounter with God. She has her own testimony that I'm just unqualified to share, but she had her own encounter and she was saved. So when that all went down and it transpired, she was the only person who was praying. She was heartbroken and heart shattered, but she said that God has a purpose, that God was going to guide me through this. And I just remember those phone calls, because you get like a phone call every week, and I would talk to her, and that's the only thing she talked about. It got to the point where I was just tired of it. Like, oh, God did this, God do that, and God is going to do this. And I'm sitting here looking at my situation like, oh, well, I guess God wants me right here, So
at what point did it start to click, like God really wanted you there?
I can't really recall the stages, right? Because there's so many emotions that I felt. Fear was probably the biggest thing, fear of the unknown. But I think somewhere just along the line, I accepted what it was. Maybe I should explain a little bit. With a juvenile, it's not, they don't give you time. And so after I went to court, after I was charged and judged and we'll say convicted, they don't believe in time. So they don't give you time. They believe in rehabilitation for juveniles, right? So they'll put you in a placement and you have to complete the therapeutic steps that they give you. And then once they see that you're fit to rejoin society, then they talk about rejoining and what that looks like. So once I understood that there is no time, right? There's no such thing as time. I could essentially age out of the program. I could be there till I'm 21 and then they have to let me go because I'm no longer a juvenile. Once I accepted that, I think things kind of calmed down. I remember my stepmother had bought me my first Bible. It was an NLT Bible. I still got to this day that is right next to my bed. But I just began to read it. No real motive, no incentive. I think I was just stuck in Proverbs and Psalms mostly because of all the emotion that I had inside. And I felt like what King David was writing was a lot of what I felt during that period. And so I would just read it because I weirdly correlated to it. So God was real, but did I accept that this was his will for my life? I can't really say that. Again, I still had those animal instincts. I just wanted to do whatever I needed to at that time. So God was real to me, but he wasn't that important during that process.
So what happened when you did get out? How did your life change? How was life before you went in, and then how was life after you came out?
Well, life after me getting out, it didn't really change. Still animalistic, I get out, so happy to be out. It's a known freedom. Now I have hot showers every day. The small things that I took for granted, I got to enjoy, right? And so there was a great appreciation there, but the identity factor, and the reason why I say identity is it's the only thing I can say looking back, because I didn't know who I wanted to be. If you had asked me when I got out, what is it that you want to be? NBA player, right? All these weird aspirations, but I did not have a game plan and I did not have a goal because I had no identity. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know who I needed to talk to find out who I was. And so as soon as I got out, I went right back into the lifestyle that I was living. Except it got a little more dangerous because at that time I joined an actual gang. I got out my 12th grade year. I started as a senior at some alternative school to get reintroduced back into society. I got expelled that same year for getting into a fight and stealing someone's phone, for assault and robbery on a school premises. I got expelled. And from there, it only got worse. It was a new neighborhood. My parents bought a brand new house. My dad bought a brand new house. Brand new neighborhood. So it was a clean slate. And somehow I find the wrong crowd to hang out with. And it all just goes downhill, except at an accelerated rate. Because now I'm selling drugs. I'm robbing people. I'm doing things that at this time I'm enjoying. Because now I have a crowd that accepts it, that condones it. It's no longer teaching, like we just do it. And I felt so much acceptance from those people. They never looked down on me. There was no disappointment that my father had expressed so many times. I felt acceptance, and so that feeling of acceptance, I ran with it. I stayed there.
And how did your father feel about you going back to this lifestyle? How did he react to this?
I tried to hide it for as long as I could, you know. I'd come home and, you know, how was your day? Well, you know, I went looking for a job, this and that. I tried to hide it for as long as I could, but it just got to the point where I'm smoking and I'm drinking and he knows that I'm doing it, you know, and I think he just accepted it. He accepted the fact that his son was moving into the development of a low-life scum, that I was going to be nothing, that I was going to be a loser, a thug. And yeah, he accepted my steps.
At what point did you begin to have like your enlightened moment where things begin to click for you and life began to make sense, or you decided, oh, I can't do this no more?
I met my wife, my now wife. Somewhere along that relationship, somewhere in the early stages, she invites me to church, and I'm just head over heels for her. So whatever she had asked me to do at that time, it was a heck yes, without hesitation. And so she invites me to church, and it's just different from what I had always known church to be. The prophetic, very scary for me at first. The presence of God, the power of God, healing, miracles. It was the demonstration of the kingdom, and I was so caught up with the emotion and with the theatrics. Right, that's how I looked at it. The theatrics of it, the emotional uproar of it. It was just so different, and so I was introduced to a whole world of church that I didn't know existed. And I think that's where the internal battle started to conflict, because now God wasn't some distant figure who only existed inside of these 66 books that I had read when I was locked up. He wasn't just something. He was someone, you know, and he existed. And so if he existed and he was real, very real, then his truth exists. And so every lie that I had lived up to that moment, all the instinct that I had lived by, the animalistic instinct, the monster instinct, the desire to be nothing in life, it clashed with his truth. And so there was an internal conflict. Now, my wife, my girlfriend at that time, you know, she ends up getting pregnant. And she still is, she's crazy about me to this day, and it's something that I thank God for. It's definitely not something that I deserve. But she would always give me ultimatums. And so I remember me being in this gang, and for anybody who knows about a gang life, you don't get in a gang just to get out. It doesn't happen like that. I'm in this gang. My girlfriend is pregnant. I am scared because I don't have a job. I'm in a gang who every week I have to give $20 for all the people who are locked up. So it's a tithe of a sort. I have to give them money, and I'm worried about how the heck I'm going to get them money. And then I also have a son on the way. I have a child on the way. And so I'm so fearful, this internal battle within me, this internal struggle. And golly, man, I remember having a talk with one of the older guys who was like 30 something, 36 or 37, whatever he was. And I said, I'm scared. You know, like, look at me. I'm a gang member and I have a son on the way. I want to have a life, but I don't think I'm going to have one. And I remember him saying, this is one of the moments in life where you're going to have to choose what it is that you need to do. And so with that in mind, you know, I spoke to my wife, and she had known that I was in a gang, and she knew that it was very serious, you know, and I would tell her almost every day when she says, why don't you just stop hanging out with them? And I said, it's not that simple. You don't just stop hanging out with people. She gave me an ultimatum. You know, it was either her or the gang, you know, and I was still head over heels. And I obviously chose her, you know. I chose her. And maybe it was from that point on that I realized that the hand of God was just on my life. Walking away from that gang, it's a term that they use, and it's called when someone gets milked. And so what that means is someone loses their flag, right? They're no longer looked at as a member of a specific gang. And so every gang has permission to beat that person on sight. Well, I think that was my biggest concern at that time, because I didn't have a car. There was no transportation. I still had to take the bus. I still had to walk. My girlfriend, my wife at that time, she had lived in a neighborhood which I couldn't just walk in. So I had to go over there. Doctor appointments. Like, there were so many things that came up that put me in these tricky situations. But surprisingly, I never found myself in a bad situation. I would be in wrong neighborhoods. I would encounter people who I probably shouldn't have encountered, and nothing ever happened. It was almost as if my bed was in hell, or my table was in hell, and there was still a meal prepared for me. There was still peace. There was still a way of communion, me to be able to have my one-on-one time with God, to grow and advance in that relationship, because I still, at that point, I didn't know who God was. He was a person, but I didn't know who he was, and I wanted to know more, but I was so scared of my current situation. So my table was in hell, but there was still a table prepared for me in that time. And so, yeah, looking back at it, I think that was really the first internal indicator that everything needs to change. I need to change. I need to seek him. Yeah.
Tell me, how did your mother feel when she found out that you were pregnant and you started having these moments of, let me get out of the gang? How did your family take this in?
Well, my stepmom and my dad were furious. They told me, whatever I do, I better not marry the girl. And Mom, if you see this, sorry. But they didn't want me to marry her, and they were talking me out of it. They're like, you're not gonna have insurance if you marry her. You're not gonna know what to do, and if you get married, you might just want to get unmarried. My real mom in California, I think she was just more happy, more excited that my journey and my path with God really began. That I had a curiosity to know him, to seek him, and to read more. She would still call and pray. She was still very concerned, but I think inside she was rejoicing, because these are years. This is years of answered prayer. She's finally getting these 3 or 4 long years of praying intensely for my salvation, and now she's starting to see the fruit of it. So for her, it was very encouraging that I wanted to know God, but she wanted to make sure that I wanted to know God and then remain in him. The curiosity would remain. I thought long and hard about what I would say to somebody who was in my shoes. If I was talking to the younger me, there are two ways I can view this. And the first one is the more realistic one. And I'm not a realist. I don't claim to be a realist, but younger me, I got advice from so many people, so many teachers, so many counselors, guidance counselors. Choose what's right, Trey. Choose to be somebody that's going to make a difference in this life. The odds are against you, but you can overcome this. I didn't hear any of it. And even people who had their own testimony, who they've been through the ringer, and then now their life is so much better. When they would tell me about their past, I didn't hear any of it. It's like I was completely shut out to it. And so sometimes when I look and I see the generation that's coming up, I almost have that same sense that I can sit here and pour my heart out and really want you to listen, right? But there are some things that people have to go through that they have to have their own experience to really say, like, okay, I need to change. And that's a hard pill to swallow. There are some people that just won't listen until they go through it themselves. The other way that I view it And I don't think it's ever been explained to me in this light. And I'd like to think that if I had heard this when I was younger, it would have made a tremendous difference. You have this short life, this very, very short life. Statistically speaking, you're not getting to 60. Statistically speaking, it'll be a miracle if you get past 21. The odds are against you, but you have this short life that determines your eternity. Your eternity. Your forever. This much to determine all of this. What happens after this life. And it is on your heart. You have thought about it. You have pondered it. The word of God says that eternity is upon the heart of every man, desiring to know the beginning and the end. All of us desire to know what is on the end. I would say this. You only have the short amount of years that God has given you. And those short amount of years will determine where you go for the rest of eternity. And either that's with God or it's without him. That's the only advice I can give. The only advice.